Happy Monday morning, class. Welcome back. You can check out the notes behind me, kind of an overview for the week on where we're going, where we've been, and how this all fits together with biology over our last 3 weeks here. So if you check out May 11th notes, they're up on the board, but they'll go into a little bit more detail online on the Google Classroom and also on the blog spot. And the first is current events. You know, I like to use CNN 10 as my current events sometimes, and there's a nice little tie-in, a local tie-in today with San Francisco to talk a little bit about fog. San Francisco is one of the choices in their first quiz about where the foggiest place in the world is, and they talk a little bit about the physics of fog, and also you can do an easy home experiment. It doesn't require that you heat the water over the stove. You can just use hot water out of the tap, and you can make your own fog at home so long as you have some ice cubes. So check that one out and try that experiment for yourself at home. And then also they do a little bit on lobster in Maine. They talk a little bit about a place called Portland, Maine, and they have lobster there, and the reason that's a note is we're going to be doing a little bit with naming species. It's called binomial nomenclature. It's a big long name. It really just means a two-name naming system for species. So scientists can be very specific about the species they're talking about, and we learned that in here. And one of the really cool things about genetics that we've been studying is the binomial nomenclature, the naming system. Tries to put things in categories. It really helps us out when we're talking about how many species are on Earth. We'll talk about that in just a second. But with a number of species, when scientists are discussing a specific species, they want to be very, very certain that they're talking about the exact same species. And we do that with a naming system that goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. That's right out of the textbook. If you check out the binomial nomenclature on how you name species, it's really helpful to be able to name things specifically. So that jumps into the first of the science notes today. Species on Earth. Right now on Earth there's roughly 10 million species. But it's important to remember that the species that are alive today on our planet is really just a small number of the millions of species that have ever existed in 3.5 billion years since life has been here on Earth. If you check out the naming system up here, a little picture of a fish and a whale to remind myself, when they first wanted to categorize the different types of species, the animals and the plants, the things that are alive on our planet, some of the early classification systems put, for example, fish and whales in the same category. Why? Well, obviously they both swim. But as you're all aware, especially after outdoor ed, you know that of course whales are marine mammals, very, very different than fish, very different evolutionary path. And when you get into genetics, it helps us very specifically figure out how closely things are related. So let's jump on into Charles Darwin. We've talked about Charles Darwin in the class a little bit. As a matter of fact, way back in January, I believe it was, we had a little coloring sheet that went along with Darwin's voyage around the world on the Beagle. And in the 1800s, one of the things we're going to go back and review just a little bit is when Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands. The main thing that he checked out in the Galapagos Islands that makes it into our textbook is the finches. Now, the other day, if you saw my notes from the other day, I hope you did, we had a finch come into this classroom. So I spent about, 15 minutes in this classroom trying to get this finch in a box to get him outside, and we did. I got him outside safely. And finches are found almost all over the world, but specifically in the Galapagos, when Darwin arrived in the Galapagos, he noticed that there was finches that had different shaped beaks. And this got into one of the key things, one of my very favorite phrases in biology, about form follows function. Their beaks were designed to do a very specific job. For example, some of the beaks, if some of the birds usually ate insects, their beaks were very specific to the type of insect they were trying to catch. If the birds were trying to eat seeds, again, the beaks were very specific to the type of seed and how they would break the seeds. The shape of the beak had everything to do with the way that it got its food, with the way that bird got its food. And when you talk form follows function, it's a wonderful phrase, originally used in architecture really, but it's a great phrase that goes along with evolution and natural selection. Now when we talk natural selection, the origin of species by natural selection, Charles Darwin's most important work. And really, I've talked about like the big three books. Of the big three books in science, this is definitely one of them. One of the things is worth throwing in here about evolution in general when people talk about evolution. About 100 years ago in America, evolution was actually kind of controversial to teach in schools. And you would hear phrases like, well, I don't think people evolved from apes. And the thing about evolution is a wonderful tool that helps explain and it gives us a way of understanding the diversity of life on Earth. When you check about humans and apes, no, humans did not evolve from apes. But humans and great apes, we have a common ancestor. And that's the beauty of evolution. When you go back on a tree, a family tree, if you will, of all living things over 3.5 billion years, the further and further you go back, you find you have more and more common ancestors. For example, whales here. Whales and fish, they don't have a very recent common ancestor. You'd have to go very far back for a common ancestor there. But it might surprise you, and we'll go into this in the notes a little bit, is that whales have a fairly recent common ancestor with an animal that was very much like a modern wolf. They evolved, they took advantage of their environment in terms of changing over millions of years to evolve a lifestyle that enabled them to live in the water. So we're going to talk about the tree of life. Very often evolution, when you talk about these different branches of evolution, it's referred to as a tree because it looks like that. When you draw it out on paper, you get the diversity of life spreading out. In any population, this is where it gets into the genetics from last week. In any population, there are variations. We talked a little bit about how if you have siblings, brother or sister, you don't look exactly like a brother or sister. They're very, very close, but there's always variation. These variations can be because of random variations and also a little bit about mutations. Now, the place where the math ties in here is we talked a little bit about probability, how that feeds in to a person's or any organism's characteristics, how you look a little bit different from siblings because of the way genetics mix. Punnett squares were a tool to help us figure out which genes you might get based on your parents. And there's also in math a rate of change. You call it genetic drift, but there's an actual rate. And again, remember the underlying words are the words that we're responsible for. A rate that you can calculate that shows how fast genes change over time within a species. So it's very, very cool, the math tie-ins that we're going to go into a little bit. And it also helps us realize that evolution takes a very long time to happen. Now, we've had 3.5 billion years on this planet for life to change and diversify. That's why we end up with 10 million species now. You give life that much time, you get a tremendous variety of species, which is the beauty of the theory of evolution, which explains so much. And then finally, one of the last things we want to check out, and it's worth mentioning because of our crossover with social studies, survival of the fittest. You hear that term sometimes. It's unfortunately been used incorrectly a lot of times by people in terms of trying to apply this to what's been called social Darwinism. For example, survival of the fittest being used to justify, for example, everything in the early days of the Industrial Revolution to some people making tremendous amounts of money while the average worker didn't. They say, well, those people must be more fit for those positions. It's been misused repeatedly in society, and one of the jobs in biology, one of the crossovers that we want to have is to say, no, what do we really mean by that? Well, in genetics, for example, with the finches, it has to do with, is the shape of the beak, for example, suited to the way this bird is trying to make a living, the way this bird is trying to get its food. By fit, it simply means, does this beak fit the shape of the beak, fit the job that it's trying to do? If it's trying to catch a bug, if it's trying to catch an insect, does the beak fit that particular job? And it's a little bit like the carpentry example I've used quite a bit. When you go in math class, you've got your tool belt, in math class, the carpentry example was Okay, you've got your addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Those are like your four tools in your tool belt. Think about the tool belt example again. If you're going in to work on something, say you're building a fence or something like that, and you want to put some nails in, are you going to use a wrench to hammer a nail in? You could try, but it's probably not going to be great. You probably want to use a hammer for that. It's exactly the same with survival of the fittest. When you're talking survival of the fittest, you're simply talking about what is the characteristic that is most fit for the way a particular organism is trying to make its living. So that's a very high-level view of what we're talking about this week with the readings on Google Classroom and also in our blog. Do check it out. Hoping to see all of you again next year or in the classroom soon. Sure is quiet in here. No finches flying around today, fortunately, so I'll get this video out to all of you. Have a great day and a great week. Talk to you soon.